London, 1940. The city breathes smoke. A pale dawn breaks through the haze, revealing streets split open by the night's raid. Roofs are gone. Trams lie on their sides. A lamppost still burns, its light trembling in the fog. Somewhere under the rubble, something ticks. A soldier kneels beside a crater, chalks 3 letters on a cracked brick wall. UXB, unexploded bomb. He steps back. Civilians stand behind cordons, silent. They've learned that silence keeps you alive. The ticking continues, slow, deliberate, metallic, like a heartbeat that shouldn't be there. A truck pulls up. 2 men step out, carrying nothing but a toolbox and a coil of wire. They look like engineers, not soldiers. Their helmets read RNVR, Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. One of them squints toward the sound, kneels in the mud, and listens. Lieutenant Commander John Bridge, physics teacher before the war. Now, the man Britain sends when a city street becomes a minefield. Most men ran from the sound of a ticking clock. He walked toward it. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand how one teacher, armed with patience and pliers, kept an island alive. Bridge sets down his toolbox and brushes away the dust. The bomb lies exposed. A steel cylinder the size of a man, lodged nose first in the street. The Luftwaffe had dropped thousands like it, but this one didn't go off. It waited. The fuse was German engineering at its most cruel. A time delay of unknown length, designed to punish anyone who tried to stop it. He wipes his glasses, leans in closer, and studies the wiring. To him, it's not a monster. It's a puzzle. There's always a reason why it hasn't exploded, he once said, and you only have to find that reason before it finds you. The air raid siren wails again, echoing through the empty streets. But Bridge doesn't flinch. He's seen too many of these. In Devonport, in Portsmouth, in every port that still breathes. The blast radius of one of these bombs can erase a street, shred concrete, and blow the roofs off houses 3 blocks away. But Bridge works in silence. He knows that even a shift in temperature could wake the fuse. Minutes pass. He listens for the faint tremor of a delayed timer. There's nothing, just the whisper of wind moving through ruins. He reaches in with long-handled pliers, slides the detonator free, and places it in a tin of sand. It clicks once, softly, like a sigh, and then stops. He exhales, sets the detonator aside, and looks down the street. Children peek from behind a shelter door, eyes wide. He nods, just once, and the tension breaks. Civilians pour back into their homes, grateful, unaware that the man who just saved them will do this 3,000 more times. In that moment, London feels alive again. But this was just one of thousands. Bombs buried under cathedrals, in rivers, in hospitals, each one a small fragment of the war's relentless math. Every night the Luftwaffe dropped their loads, and every morning men like Bridge cleaned up what didn't explode. Theirs was the quietest war, and the most unforgiving. As the camera drifts upward, smoke curls above the city's skyline. Somewhere in the distance, St. Paul's Cathedral stands, surrounded by fire but still unbroken. Under that same sky, another UXB waits, and Bridge will find it, because that's what he does. He doesn't chase victory. He maintains survival. One bomb at a time. When the bombs began to fall, Britain's defenses weren't built for what followed. The Blitz was more than destruction from above. It was a war of nerves below. Each night, thousands of high-explosive devices fell across London, Liverpool, Bristol, and the dockyards that fed the Royal Navy. They buried themselves in soft ground, under warehouses, or beneath railway lines, and waited. Not all were designed to detonate on impact. Some were meant to sit in silence for hours or even days, until the sound of human movement triggered them again. Germany had perfected delayed action fuses, small, mechanical brains that turned every unexploded bomb into a hunter. Inside each one, a clockwork timer ticked through an uncertain sequence of chemical reactions. Some were set to explode 12 hours after impact. Others could take a week. Worse still were the anti-handling devices, booby traps built to kill the men trying to make them safe. The message from the Luftwaffe was clear. If the blast didn't kill you, the curiosity would. For the British public, it meant entire districts sealed off, days at a time. Hospitals evacuated, railways paralyzed, factories silenced because a single bomb might still be alive beneath their floors. Thousands of tons of munitions now lay scattered across the kingdom, armed and waiting. The government called them UXBS, unexploded bombs, a bland abbreviation that masked terror. Every explosion that didn't happen was a delay in the nation's pulse. Firefighters could clear debris, rescue workers could dig for survivors, but until someone decided to face the unseen fuse, everything stopped. Britain was being suffocated by its own survival. The German engineers had designed it that way. Each UXB wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological strike, a way to exhaust the enemy without firing another shot. Hitler's planners knew that the more bombs failed to explode, the longer fear would linger. A silent street did more damage than a crater. Reports soon reached the War Office describing unexploded bombs lying half-buried in hospitals, shipyards, and schools. No one knew how to disarm them. There were no instructions, no schematics. British ordnance experts could only guess at how these new fuses worked. Some had magnetic sensors that detonated when disturbed by a steel tool. Others were set off by vibrations, heat, or even by the presence of seawater. To defuse one meant crawling up to a live explosive, cutting through layers of steel, and hoping you guessed the right wire first. There was no second attempt. The average lifespan of a bomb disposal officer in 1940 was measured in weeks, but for John Bridge, that uncertainty was the language he understood. His background in physics meant he grasped what few others could, that the Germans had built a deadly equation, and every variable mattered. Temperature, magnetism, timing, air pressure. All of it played into the fuse's life and death. Bridge studied every fragment of a bomb like a teacher studying a diagram. In his notes, later found after the war, he wrote, "Every fuse is a fingerprint. You must read its design before it reads you." By the end of that first year, Britain had been struck by over 2 million tons of explosives. Roughly 1 in 10 failed to detonate. That meant tens of thousands of active bombs beneath the ground, and only a handful of men willing to face them. Bridges' task wasn't glory. It was mathematics, patience, and nerve. Each UXB he faced represented an experiment with a single outcome, success or silence, and in that silence he found purpose. By the winter of 1940, Britain had a new kind of soldier, one who didn't fight back. He waited, listened, and crawled toward death with a set of pliers. The army didn't know what to call them at first. The engineers were trained to build bridges, not dismantle bombs. The Navy cleared mines from channels, not from city streets. Yet every morning, reports piled up. Unexploded devices in hospitals, schools, shipyards, and churchyards. Something had to be done. The War Office called for volunteers. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation to vanish. No training existed, no manuals, no diagrams, no safety margins. The only certainty was that every bomb you faced might be your last. In the Royal Engineers, the men joked that their unit motto should be, "We make no old men." In London, teams formed under desperate improvisation. The job title became official, Bomb Disposal Officer. They were issued overalls, steel helmets, and a van loaded with sandbags. Everything else, the technique, the method, the art of staying alive, had to be invented along the way. The Royal Navy soon realized that the danger wasn't confined to land. The Luftwaffe's new magnetic mines were crippling ports, sinking trawlers, and sealing off estuaries. These weapons didn't need direct hits. Their sensors detected metal detonating beneath a ship's hull with the force of thousands of pounds of TNT. They turned harbors into graveyards. To counter them, the Admiralty created specialized units, rendering mines safe, abbreviated to RMS. Their job? Locate, examine, and neutralize unexploded mines underwater. It required divers who could work by touch, scientists who could think under pressure, and men who had already accepted that courage wasn't a burst of heroism. It was repetition under threat. Among the first to step forward was John Bridge. He wasn't a career officer or an adventurer. He was a schoolteacher from Lancashire who had taught physics before the war. He volunteered in 1940, joining the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. His students had once asked him how magnets worked. 2 years later, he was using that same knowledge to stop them from killing sailors. Bridge's first posting was Devonport Dockyard, one of Britain's busiest naval hubs. The Luftwaffe had targeted it relentlessly. Every raid left the harbor littered with unexploded mines, most hidden below the surface, tangled in ropes and chains. Each one threatened to close the entire dock. When Bridge arrived, the atmosphere was clinical and fatalistic. Each mine was logged, examined, and marked with a chalked code before anyone dared approach it. There were no guides, only fragments of enemy devices recovered after detonation. The fuses inside were masterpieces of design, built to deceive, armed with counterweights and pressure plates that exploded if lifted the wrong way. He learned quickly that the real weapon wasn't the explosive. It was time. Every operation became a race between the bomb's internal mechanism and the officer's ability to understand it. The Navy's approach was methodical: observe, dismantle, and survive. Bridge began keeping meticulous records, sketching diagrams of every fuse he encountered. His notes would later become the foundation of British bomb disposal training. At night, he would stay in his bunk, studying German patents and fragments from recovered bombs, learning how each mechanism ticked. What made others tremble, he turned into a science. It wasn't courage that kept him going. It was logic, the kind of clarity that could only come from someone who refused to look at a bomb as a weapon. To him, it was an equation. And if there was an equation, there had to be a solution. By the end of his first month, Bridge had made safe 24 mines. By the end of the year, hundreds. Each one represented an explosion that never happened, a ship that didn't sink, a crew that didn't die, a harbor that stayed open. And yet, the toll grew heavier. Across Britain, bomb disposal teams were vanishing. 1 officer for every 6 bombs was lost. Some didn't even finish their first week. When they died, others quietly stepped into their place. No ceremony, no replacement orders, just the same ticking, waiting for the next hand brave enough to reach in. In that strange rhythm of work, fear, and silence, Britain's most dangerous profession was born. And among its ranks, one quiet man with a schoolteacher's patience began shaping the future of an entire science, Bridges' name spread quietly through the docks, whispered between sailors and port workers. He wasn't the kind of man to boast. His hands did the talking. They were steady, deliberate, unshakable. In an era when entire cities depended on courage performed in shadows, his kind of heroism never made headlines. But to those who watched him kneel beside a live mine, every motion felt like defiance. His war deepened in 1941, when the Luftwaffe shifted to mining harbors across the British coastline. The bombs that fell from the sky were terrifying, but the ones resting below the surface were worse. They turned trade routes into traps, choking Britain's lifeline of food and ammunition. Devonport, Portsmouth, Liverpool, all crippled by magnetic mines set to detonate at the slightest motion. Bridges' knowledge of physics became a weapon of survival. He understood magnetism, resonance, and current, the invisible forces the enemy had weaponized. He learned to neutralize them not with force, but with understanding. In one operation, a mine was wedged beneath a pier, its fuse ticking faintly as waves slapped against the beams. It had to be diffused underwater, in darkness, while the tide rose. Bridge descended with nothing but a torch, a wrench, and the calm certainty of calculation. He surfaced 3 hours later, soaked, shivering, and alive. The mine did not explode. He called it a close conversation with the enemy. But war had no patience for logic alone. The work came faster, deadlier. Mines evolved. Germany introduced new types, acoustic, magnetic, and pressure-based, each more unpredictable than the last. Some detonated from the sound of a ship's propeller, others triggered when disturbed by light. Every discovery the British made seemed to invite a crueler countermeasure. Bridge saw men he trained die within days. One was caught by a delayed timer that detonated while he packed his tools. Another misjudged a fuse's depth beneath the sand. Each time, Bridge recorded the cause, drew diagrams, and added notes to the growing catalog of enemy devices. His goal wasn't revenge, it was refinement. Every mistake, every explosion was a lesson written in blood. The Admiralty began sending his reports to other bases. His calm, technical language, free of emotion, focused entirely on mechanism, became the tone of a new discipline. The rendering mine's safe units started to resemble laboratories more than battlefields. Men studied fragments, traced circuits, and learned to predict what each bomb might do before touching it. Still, for all his precision, Bridge never treated the danger as routine. He worked methodically, always with quiet respect for the weapon in front of him. His philosophy was simple. You never defuse a bomb. You only convince it to stay asleep. At night, he'd sit in the mess with a cup of tea, hands trembling slightly only after the work was done. His colleagues described him as modest to the point of invisibility, a man who smiled faintly but rarely spoke of fear. Yet fear was constant, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that hums in the background of every breath. One sailor later recalled watching him walk down a pier at dawn, toolbox in hand, toward a mine lying half-submerged near a destroyer's hull. "He looked like a man going to fix a radio," the sailor said. "Only the static could kill him." As the months passed, the number of mines increased, but so did the skill of those who faced them. By the end of 1941, the Royal Navy's bomb disposal units had neutralized thousands of devices that would have otherwise destroyed fleets. Bridge himself had handled hundreds, each one unique, each one a separate conversation between human ingenuity and machine logic. The ministry began awarding decorations, the George Medal for sustained bravery under threat. Bridge received his first that year. A year later, a bar to it, a rare second award for continued gallantry. He accepted them without ceremony, storing them in a drawer, then returned to work. He had become the quiet constant in a war defined by noise. When others fought with fire and steel, he fought with stillness. While cities burned, he worked in silence, diffusing not only bombs, but panic itself. And yet, the world around him was about to change again. The war was shifting south, toward the Mediterranean, toward a new front of underwater mines, and toward the mission that would define his life. By 1942, the tide of war shifted south, and so did Bridge. The Mediterranean had become the new graveyard of ships, an underwater battlefield littered with mines designed to sink not just fleets, but the very ports that sustained them. The Germans and Italians seeded every channel, every anchorage, with explosive traps. Each one waited for the faint pulse of metal to awaken. The Royal Navy called on Bridge and a handful of specialists to form mobile teams. Their orders were clear. Clear harbors before the convoys arrived. Their conditions were lethal. Unlike land-based UXBS, these mines were alive with the tides. Their magnetic triggers shifted constantly, and the saltwater corroded their casings until the fuses were barely stable. Even brushing against one could mean instant vaporization. Bridge, now a lieutenant, worked alongside another legendary diver, Lieutenant Commander John Mould. Together, they would pioneer underwater bomb disposal. Their equipment was primitive: copper helmets, thick rubber suits, and lifelines connected to air pumps on the surface. Inside the diving suit, condensation pooled. Their vision was limited to a few feet in the murky dark. Every sound became magnified: the hiss of air, the groan of cables, the faint hum of a mine's internal clock. At first, Bridge's underwater work focused on British harbors, Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Scapa Flow. But his calm efficiency quickly drew the Admiralty's attention. When the Allies invaded Sicily in 1943, they needed the harbors cleared immediately to land reinforcements. The city of Messina, the gateway to Italy, was mined so densely that even the fish seemed to avoid it. Bridge and Mould arrived days after the bombardment ended. The water was opaque with silt and fuel. Every ship that tried to dock risked detonation. The Axis retreating forces had left behind hundreds of mines, moored, magnetic, and acoustic, many fitted with anti-handling devices to kill divers. For anyone else, it was a death sentence. For Bridge, it was a puzzle. He spent his first dive mapping the seabed with his hands. In 20 hours underwater, he located and identified several types of fuses, noting where German engineers had hidden pressure triggers beneath debris. His partner called it blind surgery. The two men worked shifts that blurred into exhaustion. Bridge surfaced only when forced to by decompression orders, his face pale, lips blue, eyes bloodshot from pressure. Yet he refused to stop. Over 10 days, they completed 28 dives, neutralizing or recovering more than 200 mines. They restored Messina's harbor, an act that reopened one of the most vital supply lines of the Italian campaign. It was quiet heroism, unrecorded by cameras and unknown to the soldiers who later marched ashore safely. When the reports reached London, the Admiralty awarded Bridge the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for bravery. The citation read, "For sustained and outstanding courage in the face of constant and imminent danger." But recognition changed nothing about how he saw himself. Bridge wrote later that every operation was a matter of logic, not bravery. The medal, he said, belonged to every man who had gone underwater and never come back. Messina had taken a toll that didn't fade. Bridges' hearing deteriorated from repeated exposure to underwater blasts. He suffered decompression sickness and nerve damage from the long dives. Still, when new requests arrived, for mines in Taranto, Naples, and Bari, he packed his tools and went. His reputation spread through the service. To young sailors, he seemed invincible, a man who could turn death into routine. But Bridge never pretended to be fearless. He later said, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to calculate through it." When the Allies advanced toward Northern Europe, Bridge returned to home waters, leading clearance teams across the Channel. Normandy, Cherbourg, Antwerp. Everywhere the war moved, he was already there, cleaning up what the bombers left behind. His final year of war was fought not in glory, but in silence. He walked docks where hundreds of men had died and listened to the faint ticking of submerged weapons. He treated each one as if it were alive, because, in a way, it was. By 1945, John Bridge had personally rendered safe or recovered over 3,000 bombs and mines. Each one could have ended him. Each one didn't. And still, he never called himself lucky. He said only that his luck was earned by patience. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Bridges' war did not end. Europe was a continent of buried steel, unexploded bombs beneath fields, harbors, and factories. For years, they kept killing long after the ceasefire. He stayed in uniform to finish what he had started, leading naval clearance operations across the Channel and into the ports of Belgium and Holland. Each mission carried the same quiet risk. The difference now was that no one called it war. The Scheldt estuary was one of his last major operations. It was the artery feeding Antwerp, a port essential for Allied logistics. The Germans had left it seeded with magnetic and acoustic mines, buried under layers of silt. Ships could not enter, and entire battalions were stranded without supplies. Bridge and his team spent weeks wading through freezing water, their sonar equipment primitive, their success dependent mostly on instinct. They worked in silence, cutting cables by hand, marking cleared channels with floating drums. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential. Each mine they lifted was another convoy that could pass safely to feed a starving continent. By war's end, Bridge had done what no one else had. He'd faced over 3,000 explosive devices and survived. No one doubted the odds were impossible. The statistics alone made it a miracle. The bomb disposal branch, across all services, had one of the highest casualty rates of the war. For every officer who made it through, several others were gone, erased in an instant, leaving only craters and names on plaques. Bridge returned to England, carrying that silence with him. There were no parades for bomb disposal men, no grand speeches. Their victories were invisible. He went back to teaching physics, the same classrooms, the same chalk, but a different man. The students never guessed that their teacher had once spent hours lying face down in mud, listening for the faint hum of a detonator. He rarely spoke about the war. When pressed, he would describe it as a job that needed doing. Only decades later, in interviews, did he admit that each bomb had left an impression, not just in memory, but in rhythm. "They all ticked differently," he said. "You learned to tell when one was lying." The medals he received, the George Cross, the George Medal and Bar, the King's Commendation, remained in a drawer, wrapped in cloth. For him, they were reminders, not trophies. The true legacy was the system he helped build, the Royal Navy's clearance diving branch. He trained younger men to do what he had done, to approach danger with method, patience, and respect. His lessons became doctrine, forming the backbone of modern naval EOD, explosive ordnance disposal. Bridge lived a long life, dying in 2006 at the age of 91. In his final years, he would attend memorials quietly, standing a few steps back as others read the names of those who had not survived. He always insisted that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. He once told a naval historian, "Every mine you lift feels like you've cheated something larger than war, as if death was patient, and you just kept it waiting." His story remains one of quiet defiance, of a man who faced machines designed for instant death and turned them into moments of stillness. In the end, there was no explosion, no cinematic finale. Just an old man in a quiet English town, listening to the ticking of a clock that never stopped. In the decades that followed, the men who defused bombs became shadows in Britain's post-war memory. The pilots, the commandos, the tank crews. They filled books and cinema screens. But the bomb disposal officers were invisible by design. Their victories were measured in the absence of disaster. You never heard the explosion that didn't happen, never saw the ship that didn't sink. John Bridge didn't mind the silence. He once said he'd had enough noise for a lifetime. Yet his work echoed everywhere, in every harbor cleared, in every child who played safely on ground that once hid unexploded mines. He represented a generation of men whose courage was mathematical, not impulsive. They were calm because they had to be. Fear and logic couldn't coexist in a crawlspace beside a live fuse. Bridge became an instructor at the Royal Navy's diving school, where he rewrote the principles of mine clearance from experience rather than theory. The manual he helped design, the first formal bomb disposal training guide, began with a single sentence: "Approach with respect. No man is faster than a detonator." It was simple, and it saved lives. His teaching methods were practical. He trained recruits in the dark, forcing them to rely on sound and feel, as he had in Messina. Many of them didn't realize their quiet instructor was one of the most decorated naval officers of the war. When they did, he would shrug and say, "It wasn't bravery. It was maintenance work for the living." Through his guidance, Britain's post-war clearance diving branch grew into one of the most skilled in the world. These divers would later remove old wartime ordnance from ports, recover sunken munitions, and even assist in Cold War nuclear recovery missions. Every safety protocol, every controlled detonation could trace its lineage back to Bridge's wartime lessons. He also worked closely with scientists studying blast physics, sharing field observations that informed the design of safer detonation chambers and magnetic influence countermeasures. It was, in a quiet way, his return to science, the profession he had abandoned when the first bombs fell on London. Despite the accolades, Bridge carried an unspoken burden. Many of his peers were gone, men he'd trained with, men who had disarmed the same bombs and mines and simply run out of luck. The official records list over 300 British bomb disposal officers killed in action during the war, their names etched on memorials few visit. Bridge made it a point to attend each unveiling he could. He stood alone, hands clasped behind his back, as if waiting for orders that would never come. In interviews from the 1980s, his voice had softened, but his memory hadn't. He still recalled the faint metallic clicks, the way silt clouded around his visor, the way the water always seemed colder when he surfaced. When asked how he stayed calm, he smiled and said, "I didn't. I just learned not to shake while I thought." For a man who had defused more than 3,000 bombs, he remained most proud of the ones he never had to touch, the ones his teams rendered safe because they had learned from his mistakes. That, to him, was legacy. Not medals, not ceremonies, but the continuation of survival through discipline. He often returned to Messina in his thoughts. The harbor was alive again, ships docking where death once waited. He would later learn that the local fishermen still told stories of the English diver who made the water safe. He never confirmed it. He didn't need to. As old age slowed his step, he continued to live quietly by the sea in northwest England. When he finally passed in 2006, it was not with the drama that had defined his youth. There were no explosions left to silence, just stillness, the same stillness he'd once risked his life to create. And somewhere, beneath a calm ocean, the minds he once faced still sleep, made harmless by a man who believed precision could conquer fear. Long before history remembered him as a national hero, John Bridge was just another teacher who understood how things worked, how circuits completed, how pressure changed underwater, how magnetism could turn invisible forces into motion. Those same lessons would later save hundreds of lives. But what made him different was not simply knowledge, it was restraint. During the war, bomb disposal men lived by seconds. The difference between courage and death was often a single breath. Bridge had mastered the art of stillness, the discipline to wait, to listen, to think, while surrounded by a weapon designed to punish hesitation. That mental precision was what made him invaluable to the Royal Navy's clearance operations. As peace settled across Europe, Bridge's contributions became part of Britain's institutional memory. His methods turned into protocols, and those protocols evolved into a profession. Every modern explosive ordnance technician, every naval diver tasked with neutralizing a mine, owes a trace of their training to his experience. His diagrams and notes, sketches drawn in salt-stained notebooks during the war, became teaching tools decades later. The men who followed him called it bridge logic. It wasn't a formula, but a mindset. Patience over panic. Observation before action. He had once said that explosives were honest machines. They only lied when you stopped paying attention. Bridge's influence stretched beyond the military. Civilian bomb squads that formed during the Cold War adapted his clearance methods for urban settings. His wartime approach, a blend of intuition, science, and respect for the unseen, became the foundation for public safety in peacetime. Without men like him, post-war Britain would have remained a nation walking over hidden graves. Yet he never allowed hero worship. To those who tried to celebrate him, he would only remind them of the ones who didn't return. His humility was not an act of modesty. It was the natural response of someone who had seen too many close calls. He had been in the presence of forces that could erase identity in a blink. After that, ego seemed absurd. Bridge also carried an unspoken belief that his survival had been an accident, that his endurance had no explanation beyond chance. But those who worked with him disagreed. They said his survival came from method, not luck. He survived because he never stopped learning. Each mistake, whether his or someone else's, became a lesson, added quietly to his invisible library of experience. One of his closest post-war colleagues recalled a rare moment of reflection. He told me that the bomb disposal man's real enemy isn't the fuse, it's fatigue. When you're tired enough, you start trusting your instincts instead of your instruments. That's when you die. Bridge never lost that understanding. Even as old age dimmed his sight and slowed his step, his mind remained methodical. When younger divers visited him for advice, he would tell them to focus on details, the sound of air bubbles, the tension in a rope, the rhythm of their own heartbeat. That's where safety lives, he said, in the small things. When he died, the Royal Navy lowered its flags in his honor. His medals, the George Cross, the George Medal and Bar, and the king's commendation were displayed briefly before being returned to his family. At his funeral, one of his students delivered the eulogy. It ended with a single line. He taught us that courage isn't about standing tall. It's about kneeling before danger and staying still. John Bridges' story is not about a man who defused bombs. It's about one who redefined bravery, not as the absence of fear, but as mastery over it. He proved that even in a world built on destruction, precision, and patience, could still save life. And somewhere in the archives of the Royal Navy, his name remains written beside a simple phrase, rendered safe. There was one last truth about John Bridge that few ever understood. He didn't see himself as a hero of war. He saw himself as a custodian of order in chaos. Every operation he led was a dialogue with death, spoken in clicks, hisses, and the hum of underwater pressure. His courage was not reckless or loud. It was measured, deliberate, the product of a mind that trusted numbers more than faith. By the end of the war, Bridges' record was unlike any other. Over 3,000 devices neutralized across harbors, beaches, rivers, and shipwrecks. But statistics could never capture what that meant. Each entry in his logbook represented a moment of suspended time, a street that didn't collapse, a ship that didn't sink, a family that never knew how close they came to loss. In his post-war debriefs, Bridge described his work in the same tone a teacher might use to explain a classroom experiment. He talked about magnetic fields, detonator mechanisms, and fuse delays with the calm detachment of a physicist. Yet those who read between the lines could feel the weight behind every sentence, the quiet acknowledgement that one misjudgment could have ended his life. When historians later reviewed the bomb disposal program, they found Bridges' influence in every surviving report. He had documented not only his successes, but also his mistakes. He believed that failure, recorded honestly, was a moral duty, because someone else's survival might depend on it. That honesty became part of the Royal Navy's doctrine and remains so today. In later years, he was invited to speak at military academies and engineering conferences. He never told stories of heroism. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, how knowledge could save lives if used carefully and destroy them if treated carelessly. One officer remembered him saying, "Every device is built by a man. To defeat it, you have to think like one." He carried no bitterness toward his enemies. When asked about the German engineers who had designed the mines that nearly killed him, he said simply, "They were doing their work." So was I to Bridge. War had never been about hatred, only about endurance and problem-solving in its purest, most unforgiving form. As his health declined, he continued to correspond with younger clearance divers. He wrote long letters in his careful academic handwriting, offering advice that read more like philosophy than instruction. "Patience," he wrote in one, "is not waiting. It is thinking clearly under pressure." In another, "Every bomb has its own logic. Respect it, and you'll live." When his name resurfaced in the 1990s, journalists tried to cast him as a forgotten hero. Bridge resisted every attempt. "If you want to write about heroes," he told one reporter, "write about the ones who didn't get to tell their story." It was not false modesty. It was loyalty to the men who had crawled beside him, to the quiet fraternity of those who faced impossible odds without expecting thanks. When he finally passed away in 2006, the obituaries were brief but dignified. They called him Britain's most decorated bomb disposal diver, but none could capture what made him unique. His legacy wasn't in medals or memorials. It was in the silence that followed his work. Because for every blast that never happened, for every city block that remained standing, there was a man like John Bridge. Steady hands, clear eyes, a heartbeat that refused to race. He defused 3,000 bombs, and he knew one of them would end him. It never did, but he never stopped listening for the tick. Even decades after the guns fell silent, the echoes of John Bridge's work still lingered beneath the sea. Along Britain's coasts, on the seabed of the Mediterranean, in forgotten estuaries and harbors, thousands of wartime minds remained buried in silt, dormant but alive. Each one was a relic of a conflict that refused to die quietly, and each time a modern diver descended to face one, they did so following the same procedures, the same mental rhythm that Bridge had pioneered. His lessons lived on not through textbooks, but through muscle memory passed down from hand to hand. By the early 2000s, the Royal Navy's clearance divers were operating with advanced sonar, robotics, and protective gear, tools Bridge could never have imagined. Yet when interviewed about their craft, many still spoke of him as if he were a mythic figure. They called him the quiet man of the deep, the one who taught their predecessors to trust silence over speed. One instructor summed it up best: "Bridge gave us the science. The rest of us just added the machines." His influence also reached far beyond military circles. In civilian life, as old bombs surfaced during construction projects or dredging operations, it was his wartime documentation that provided the baseline for safe removal. The principles of containment, magnetic shielding, and stepwise disarmament, all drawn from his field notebooks, were still being cited 60 years later. The same handwriting that once described a fuse in a cramped submarine cabin was now keeping demolition teams alive in peacetime London. There was an irony in that a man who spent his youth fighting destruction would spend his legacy preserving the living. But Bridge never saw it that way. To him, destruction and preservation were part of the same equation. "A bomb is neutral until someone mishandles it," he once wrote. "It's human error that makes it lethal." It was a simple statement, but one that summed up his entire philosophy: that precision, discipline, and understanding could turn fear into control. In his later years, when he occasionally spoke to students, he avoided recounting the horrors of war. Instead, he described the calm, the strange, almost spiritual stillness that came when he was inches from detonation. He said that in those moments, there was no noise, no panic, no time. Just the sound of breathing through his mask and the faint hum of the sea pressing down. That was where courage lived. Not in shouting, not in medals, but in the quiet acceptance of what had to be done. As one historian later wrote, Bridge's war was not about conquest or defiance. It was about equilibrium, between chaos and control, between death and survival. That balance defined him. He was a soldier, yes, but more than that, he was a scientist who treated war as a problem to be solved, not a banner to be raised. Today, his medals rest in the Royal Navy Museum, behind glass and soft light. The George Cross ribbon has faded slightly, but his nameplate beneath it remains clear. Visitors often walk past it without noticing. But for those who stop, for those who read the small plaque beside it, the story becomes something larger than one man's bravery. It becomes a reflection of a time when survival depended not on aggression, but on intellect, when the bravest act imaginable was to stay calm in the presence of fear. John Bridge's life was proof that heroism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it breathes quietly underwater, beneath layers of ice and silence. Sometimes it's a pair of hands holding steady over a ticking fuse, guided by the simple belief that even in the darkest moments of war, reason could still triumph over chaos. He defused bombs until there were none left to silence. And when he was gone, the world kept its quiet. Years after his passing, the men who followed in John Bridges' footsteps still spoke his name with a kind of quiet reverence. In naval training rooms across Britain, instructors repeated his maxims like scripture: never rush, never assume, never trust the fuse. Young divers who never met him still recognized his methods, embedded deep within every safety protocol and manual they studied. They knew the stories, how he'd crawled through mud, dove through oil-slick harbors, or worked by touch alone in black water. And yet what they admired most wasn't his survival. It was his calm. Bridge had proven that courage was not the absence of fear, but mastery over it. Where others froze, he focused. Where others shouted, he thought. Every operation he led began not with orders, but with silence. He'd take a breath, close his eyes, and imagine the mechanism inside the bomb, its wires, its triggers, the hidden geometry of death. To him, the enemy wasn't Germany or Japan. It was error, and that war never ended. Even long after World War II, the same unexploded relics kept surfacing: rusted shells, sea mines lodged in estuaries, time-fused bombs buried beneath modern streets. Whenever one was found, it was the lineage of Bridges' men who came to disarm it. Each operation felt like a quiet conversation with the past, a continuation of his work. When a diver neutralized a mine in the North Sea, or a sapper cleared a 500-pound bomb beneath London, they were, in a sense, finishing his war. Bridge himself would have shrugged at the idea of legacy. He had never sought immortality. Yet history often reserves its longest memory for those who never asked for it. The medals, the citations, the articles, all came after. What mattered most to him were the people he trained, the lives that continued because a job had been done correctly. Precision had been his faith. It was, in his words, the only thing that could make chaos listen. He lived long enough to see the world change, to see new wars fought by remote control, new machines take over the work that once demanded a human heartbeat and a steady hand. But even then, his influence endured. Every robot submersible that rolled toward a ticking device, every diver who felt the pulse of a detonator through gloves, was working inside the echo of a method born in 1940. And yet, when the historian summarized his achievements, 3,000 bombs, thousands of lives saved, they still missed something vital. Numbers didn't capture the loneliness of his craft. The long hours spent crouched in silence, the smell of cordite and seaweed, the knowledge that even success carried no celebration. It was not the kind of heroism one could film. It was invisible, measured only in things that didn't happen: a dock that didn't explode, a ship that made it home. Toward the end of his life, Bridge was asked what it felt like, knowing that a single mistake could have ended everything. He smiled faintly and said, "I never thought about dying. I only thought about doing the next right thing." That line, more than any medal or speech, defined him, because beneath all the tension and science, his story was not about bombs at all. It was about discipline, humility, and the enduring power of calm thought in a world built on noise. He walked toward the ticking when others ran, not out of fearlessness, but because someone had to. And when he left this world, he left it quieter than he found it. In the years that followed, Britain rebuilt, cities healed, and children played in parks that had once been craters. But beneath the calm surface of peacetime, the ghosts of the war still slept in the soil and sea. Thousands of unexploded bombs remained buried, some just a few feet below the pavements of London or the sandbanks of the Thames. Each one was a silent echo of that same sound Bridge had chased all his life: the faint, steady tick of unfinished danger. He had taught the men who would go on to face those ghosts. They were younger, equipped with better tools, protected by better suits, but the principle remained unchanged: patience, precision, respect. Bridges' rules became doctrine, his methods the backbone of modern explosive ordnance disposal. Every detonation prevented, every life preserved, traced its lineage back to him and the handful of men who first learned to diffuse chaos with logic. Bridge often said that war never really ended, it just changed shape. And in a way, he was right. He saw it not as a series of battles, but as a long struggle between understanding and ignorance. Where others saw destruction, he saw lessons. To him, each bomb was not only a threat, but a teacher, a reminder that arrogance and haste were mankind's oldest enemies. "A bomb doesn't hate," he once told a young diver. "It just waits for a mistake." By the 1970s, he had returned fully to teaching, standing once again in front of a classroom, chalk dust on his fingers instead of cordite. His students had no idea that their quiet physics lecturer had once crawled through the rubble of blitzed cities or disarmed weapons in the dark bellies of ships. When they learned, years later, they said it suddenly made sense. The patience, the precision, the refusal to guess when one could measure. He carried the war lightly, but it never truly left him. At reunions of bomb disposal officers, he often sat apart, listening more than he spoke. When others shared stories, he would nod, sometimes smile, but his eyes drifted far away, back to the docks, to the cold, to the sound that had followed him through the years. The ticking was gone, but its rhythm had settled in his memory, permanent as breath. When he died in 2006, the funeral was simple. Navy officers stood in silent formation, medals glinting softly in the afternoon light. A folded flag rested on the coffin, and among the flowers lay a small brass clock. Its hands stopped at 12. It was placed there by one of his former trainees, a symbolic gesture, the end of the ticking that had defined his life. Today, when clearance divers descend into the depths, they carry devices that can map explosives with precision unimaginable in his time. Yet they still begin the same way he did: a deep breath, a moment of silence, and then the careful, deliberate motion of hands meeting danger without fear. They may not say his name aloud, but his presence moves through the water with them, a ghost of patience, a whisper of calm in the roaring dark. John Bridges' war ended long ago, but his discipline never did. It remains wherever men and women confront the quiet machinery of destruction and choose, once again, to understand it rather than fear it. And in that way, even now, the teacher still guides the lesson. In the end, John Bridges' legacy was not built on explosions, but on the silence that followed them. His war had been one of endurance, fought not in headlines or sweeping offensives, but in hours of stillness, each one a conversation with death conducted through steel, salt, and patience. For every bomb he touched, thousands of lives were spared. Yet the measure of his courage was never counted in numbers. It was written in the quiet spaces between disaster and survival. When historians tell the story of the Second World War, they often speak of the skies above Britain or the beaches of Normandy. Few remember the men who fought their battles on the ground beneath those triumphs, lying face down in the mud, unraveling the logic of weapons built to deceive. Bridge was one of them, a man who met the enemy not with rifles or rage, but with reason, and in doing so, he redefined what it meant to be brave. He never called himself a hero. In interviews, when asked how he found the nerve to face so many bombs, he only said, "Someone had to. I just happened to be there." But that humility was its own kind of truth. because real heroism often begins exactly there, in the ordinary acceptance of an impossible task. The medals that now rest in glass cases at the Royal Navy Museum are tokens of that quiet defiance, reminders that courage can exist without spectacle. There is something profoundly human about Bridges' story, the image of a man alone in a flooded dock, listening for the faint pulse of danger, knowing that one slip would mean the end, and still choosing to continue. It was not glory that guided him, nor even duty, but understanding. Each device was a puzzle, and each successful defusal was a small restoration of order in a world unraveled by war. In that sense, he was more than a soldier. He was a craftsman of peace, one who created safety not by destroying the enemy, but by dismantling fear itself. And when he was gone, the silence he had protected became his memorial. Today, if you walk through the docks at Devonport, the air smells of oil and salt as it did then. The cranes creak, the water laps against rusted hulls, and somewhere below, buried in the silt, are the remnants of his work, diffused, inert, harmless. The danger has long since gone, but the discipline remains. Every diver who slips beneath the surface carries it with them. Every breath, every movement, every pause before the final cut. Those are echoes of him. He defused over 3,000 bombs. He faced terror until it became routine. He lived his life by the quiet conviction that precision and courage were the same thing. And when at last the ticking stopped, the world was a little safer, a little calmer, because he had been there to listen. John Bridges' story ends not with an explosion, but with a breath held steady in the dark. One man, one moment, against the machinery of war.